That night began as ordinarily as dozens of others. I couldn't even imagine how it would change everything I thought was unchangeable. My name is Samantha Hill, I'm 19, and I had just returned from college for the long winter holidays. My father, Edward, as always, had gone on his annual hunt, not just a pastime for him, but almost a sacred ritual that he never refused. My stepmother, Lillian, and I were left in our large suburban Chicago home. It was just another weekend when I thought I could rest from studying. Saturday morning turned out to be strange. The house seemed too quiet. Even the sound of the coffee maker, usually invigorating, seemed to fade into the void. I pretended to be engrossed in my textbooks, but my gaze kept returning to Lillian. Her light gait, as if she were floating through the room, was tense today. She looked at me, but her gaze was scrutinizing, strangely deep, as if she saw not just her husband's daughter, but something more. "Sam," she called me after lunch when I was about to go upstairs. Her voice sounded soft, but there was a strange note in it that made me freeze. Usually, her requests were about something trivial, bringing something from the garage, sorting out purchases. But now her intonation seemed strangely personal. "Of course, what do you need?" I replied, trying to hide my embarrassment. She gestured for me to come into the living room. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting shadows on the furniture, but the atmosphere was almost tangibly tense. Lillian sat on the sofa and patted the seat next to her. I sat down, trying not to show how strange it felt to be in her company alone. Usually Dad was always around, his loud laughter or soft voice creating a familiar atmosphere. Now everything was different. "You're all grown up," she said, and there was a smile in her voice, but her eyes revealed something else, a mix of warmth and hidden excitement. "I guess so," I replied, unsure where this conversation was going. Lillian leaned closer, her gaze intense, almost hypnotic. This was not the woman I had known for years, always restrained, elegant, kind, but strict. Something had changed in her face, her posture. She looked like she wanted to say something but was afraid. "You've changed, Sam," she continued. "You're no longer the girl I remember." Her words hung in the air. They were simple, but I felt there was more behind them. My pulse quickened and I forced myself to look away, but her words stuck in my mind. "I think you're exaggerating," I said, hoping to steer the conversation to a lighter tone. Lillian smiled, but her gaze remained focused. She reached for the cup of coffee on the table and took a slow sip. Then she looked at me again, and I felt a strange warmth, as if her eyes were piercing me. "Do you feel that everything is changing?" she asked softly. I swallowed, not knowing how to respond. Everything inside me screamed that this conversation was becoming dangerous, but I couldn't look away from her gaze. It was like a web in which I was already caught, even without realizing how it happened. "What exactly do you mean?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She held her gaze on me for another second, then looked out the window. The sun's rays played on her light hair, and for a moment, I thought she was about to say something important. But instead she stood up, straightened her shirt, and stepped back. "Nothing," she replied with a slight smile. "Just thoughts out loud." I felt that this was not the end. Lillian was always complex to understand, but there was always logic in her words and actions. Today, however, she was different, as if searching for something but afraid to find it. When I went upstairs, leaving her in the living room, my heart was still pounding. I tried to convince myself that nothing strange had happened, but the feelings didn't go away. Questions arose one after another. What did Lillian mean? Why did her words sound so ambiguous? And most importantly, why couldn't I stop thinking about it? All day I tried to forget the morning conversation with Lillian. I forced myself to delve into textbooks, listen to music, even helped her in the kitchen. But every movement, every glance of hers clung to my thoughts, as if they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand what. By evening it got even worse. The house filled with a thick, almost tangible tension. I heard Lillian walking through the rooms, her steps soft, barely audible, but each sound seemed to echo in my head. Dad was always noisy, and his absence made the house feel like a frozen theater where the actors were afraid to break the silence. I locked myself in my room, but even that didn't help. Time dragged on and thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. What was she trying to say? Why was it so hard for me to be around her? Or was it all in my head? When I was about to go to bed, I heard a knock at the door. I jumped at the sound of her voice. "Sam, are you still awake?" Her tone was calm, but behind it, there was something deeper, as if she was unsure whether to bother me. "No," I replied, feeling my heart start to beat faster. "Is something wrong?" "I just wanted to talk," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "If you're not busy." I hesitated. Everything inside me told me this was a bad idea. But refusing seemed rude. Or maybe I was just too curious. I went to the door and opened it. Lillian stood there, her face soft, but her eyes still held attention. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "No," she replied and stepped back, inviting me out. "I just can't sleep. I thought maybe you couldn't either." I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken, and followed her downstairs. In the living room, the light was on, and on the table stood a glass of wine. Lillian sat on the sofa and gestured for me to join her. I sat down, but this time I left more space between us than in the morning. "Everything is fine, Sam," she said with a slight smile. "You look tense." "Me?" I tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained. "I think it's just fatigue." She studied me, her gaze soft but too intense. It was the kind of look that penetrates all your defenses, making you feel vulnerable. "I've been thinking about you," she said suddenly, her voice softer. "About how you've grown up." These words hung in the air, causing a strange feeling inside me. I didn't know how to react to them, and all I could do was smile, hoping she would stop. "You've always been smart, strong," she continued. "But now I see something new in you. You're becoming a woman, and it's amazing." I couldn't understand why she was saying this. Was it just an observation, an attempt to compliment, or was there more behind her words? I felt my face flush, but I couldn't do anything about it. "Thank you," I muttered, trying to bring the conversation back to safer ground. "I think it's just natural. Everyone changes." She smiled, but her eyes didn't leave mine. In them was something new, something I had never noticed before. It was a look full of warmth, but also something more complex, something I couldn't understand. "Do you really not notice?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Notice what?" I asked, feeling my palms become sweaty. "How you've become something more to me than just my husband's daughter." Her words were soft, but each one hit me like a wave. I froze. My thoughts raced, trying to find some meaning in her words. I didn't know what to say, and my voice stuck in my throat. Lillian looked at me, her face calm, but her eyes held determination. "Lillian, I think," I began, but she raised her hand, stopping me. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "Just think about it. Sometimes in life things change and we can't control it." I felt her words clinging to my thoughts, her gaze still holding me, even as she leaned back and took the glass again. I wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to leave or at least change the topic. But instead I stayed seated, feeling the room become even tighter, the air thicker. That night turned out to be long. Every glance, every pause filled me with a strange feeling. I couldn't understand what had changed between us, but something couldn't return to its previous place. The next day passed like a haze. I avoided Lillian as much as I could, locking myself in my room, pretending to be engrossed in textbooks, or going out for long walks just to not be around her. But every time I returned, I felt her presence, as if she was always there, even if we didn't see each other. Dad returned from his hunt on the third day, bringing a semblance of normality to the house. His loud voice and good-natured laughter broke the heavy atmosphere that hung between Lillian and me. He talked about the weather, work, even showed photos of his trophies, not noticing how Lillian and I barely looked at each other. But even in those moments I felt her gaze. She stole glances at me across the kitchen table, her eyes trying to meet mine. I pretended not to notice. It seemed that if I just ignored her, everything would return to normal. But a deep part of me knew it was an illusion. The next evening, Dad stayed late at work. I heard her steps outside my door. This time she didn't knock, just opened the door. Her face looked tense, and in her eyes was something that I couldn't look away from. "Sam, will you come down?" she asked, her voice soft but with something that made my mouth dry. I opened a bottle of wine. "You know I don't like drinking alone." "I think so," I said, though my feet felt rooted to the floor. I followed her downstairs, as if not controlling my movements. In the living room, the fireplace was lit, its soft light playing on the walls, making the room especially cozy. Lillian sat on the sofa with a glass in her hands and pointed to a spot next to her. I sat down, trying to keep my distance, but I felt the tension filling the entire space. "You've always been so serious," she began, and her voice, soft and slow, enveloped me like a veil. "Sometimes I think you're older than you really are." "I just try to keep everything under control," I replied, unsure where she was leading. She smiled, her lips curved, but her eyes remained serious. "Sometimes control isn't that important, Sam. Sometimes you just have to let yourself be." These words sounded simple, but I felt there was more behind them. Lillian reached for the bottle, refilled her glass, and asked, "Are you sure you don't want to try? Just a sip for company." I hesitated, but her voice was so convincing that I gave in. The glass ended up in my hands, and the taste of wine was soft, with a barely perceptible bitterness. Lillian looked at me, her gaze full of expectation. "Good, right?" she said. "Yes, quite," I replied, feeling my cheeks start to burn. For a while we were silent, only the crackling of the firewood in the fireplace breaking the silence. I felt her closeness, her scent, subtle, floral, which had always been her signature. This didn't let me relax. "Do you remember how your father and I met?" she suddenly asked, her voice warm, almost nostalgic. "Yes," I said. "It was at a party at your mutual friend's. You seemed so unusual then." "Unusual?" She laughed, but there was a note of bitterness in her voice. "I've probably always been that way. But it doesn't always make life easier." She leaned back, her hand slid along the armrest, and her fingers barely touched mine. This gesture was accidental, but it made me hold my breath. She removed her hand just as quickly as she had placed it, but I felt my heart start to beat faster. "Sometimes I think your father is lucky with you," she said softly, looking at me. "You're so smart, strong, and there's something in you that attracts people. Have you noticed?" "I don't think so," I replied, feeling my face become hot. "You shouldn't. You're special, Sam." Her words sounded as if she knew me better than I knew myself. I tried to change the subject, asking about her work, about the book she had recently read, but her answers were short. It seemed she was waiting for something else, as if this conversation was just a prelude to something more important. Then there was silence. It was not an ordinary pause, but one that fills the entire space between people when words are no longer needed. I felt Lillian looking at me, and when I looked up, I saw her gaze, soft but penetrating. "Sam," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Have you ever thought that some things happen for a reason?" "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling the tension in the room becoming almost unbearable. "I think everything has a meaning," she said softly. "Even the fact that we're here together." These words made me freeze. I didn't know what to say, and my voice traitorously stuck in my throat. Her eyes were searching mine, as if trying to understand what I was feeling. Then she leaned slightly forward, her hair touching my shoulder. "You know what I mean," she said, her voice so soft I could barely hear it. I wanted to say something, to find words that could break this atmosphere, but nothing came to mind. Inside me, everything screamed that this was wrong, that I should push her away, say it was wrong, but instead I stayed still. I completely gave in to her control. She used her palms to caress me below. Her tongue touched my nipples, they were maximally tense. I was all on fire with passion and desire. At the moment when she slid down with her kisses, I was on the edge of sensations. But when she began to caress me with her tongue, I felt something new awakening inside me. I couldn't hold back, and I started doing the same to her body. We twisted like snakes, caressing each other. Our bodies were on fire with passion and shuddered with pleasure and ecstasy. When she pulled away, her eyes were full of emotions I couldn't read. My conscience screamed that I should stop, but I couldn't. All I could do was look at her, feeling my life spin out of control. After that night, the world was no longer the same. Every day felt like walking on thin ice. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in with each passing day. Everything that had happened between Lillian and me couldn't be forgotten. It hung in the air like an electric charge, ready to spark at the slightest provocation. I tried to avoid her. Even her presence evoked a storm of emotions in me. Shame, guilt, but also something strange that I couldn't explain. Lillian, on the other hand, seemed not to try to hide her feelings. Her gaze was insistent, her words deliberate, every gesture filled with meaning. She didn't try to back down, and this scared me even more. Dad was home, and his presence felt like both salvation and torture. Every time he talked about how happy he was to have such a family, I felt a growing fear inside me. I was afraid he would notice how I avoided looking Lillian in the eye, how my speech became stammering when she was around. But he seemed not to suspect anything. On the 5th day after that night, I decided I couldn't stay at home anymore. I said I was going to meet a friend from college, but I just went to the nearest park. The winter air burned my lungs, but I needed it. I had to think, to sort myself out. I sat on a bench looking at the bare branches swaying in the wind, and thought about how I could have come to this. Lillian was my stepmother, my father's wife. But when I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but remember her gaze, her touch, the warmth of her lips. I didn't return home until late evening. When I entered the door, the house was enveloped in silence. Dad had already gone to bed, and the only sound was the soft hum of the TV from the living room. I knew Lillian was there. I could have just walked past, gone upstairs, but instead my feet led me to the living room. She was sitting on the sofa, her hair loose, holding a glass of wine in her hands. She looked at me, and I felt all the tension of the past days rush back. "You came back late," she said calmly, but her voice was softer than usual. "Yes," I replied, standing at the door, not knowing what to say. She gestured for me to sit. I hesitated, then approached and carefully sat down on the other end of the sofa. There was distance between us, but it felt just as heavy as those feelings I was trying to suppress. "You've been avoiding me," she said, not taking her eyes off me. "No, I began but stopped, realizing it sounded too unbelievable. "I don't know how to deal with this." "And you think I do?" she replied, and there was bitterness in her voice. "This isn't easy, Sam, but sometimes feelings are stronger than rules." Her words were soft, but they resonated within me, as if she had expressed what I was afraid to admit. She took a step closer, and I felt my breath become uneven. "This is wrong," I said, unsure who I was trying to convince, her or myself. "We can't." "Why can't we?" she interrupted, her voice firmer. "Who decides what's right?" Her words stuck in my head. I knew she was wrong, but her confidence confused me. Her hand slid to mine, her fingers lightly touching my palm, and I couldn't pull away. "You feel this just as I do," she said, her eyes not leaving mine. "Why do you pretend it's not so?" My mind screamed at me to stand up and leave, but I couldn't. I was as if caught in her net, her voice wrapping around me like ribbons, tightening more and more. "Because it's wrong," I said, but my voice trembled. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly leaned closer, her breath touching my skin. I felt her lips barely touch mine, softly, like the touch of a petal. This was not like our first kiss. This one was full of emotions that couldn't be ignored. When we pulled away, I felt as if the whole world had turned upside down. Lillian looked at me, her gaze soft but determined. "I can't make you feel the same way," she said, her voice hoarse. "But Sam, I can't deny it anymore." I didn't answer. Words stuck in my throat, and emotions overwhelmed me, threatening to burst out. All I could do was stand up and leave, leaving her sitting in the living room in silence. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind constantly returning to what had happened. I tried to find answers, to understand how we had come to this. But deep down I knew it was inevitable. The next morning, the house seemed even quieter than usual. Dad had left early, leaving us alone. I tried to find something to do. washing dishes, sorting books on the shelf, even starting to unpack my things from college. But it was all useless. Thoughts of Lillian haunted me like a shadow that couldn't be ignored. She approached me around noon. Her steps were soft, but I felt her presence even before she spoke. "We need to talk," she said, her voice soft but firm. I froze, continuing to sort through my things as if I hadn't heard her. "Sam, you can't hide from this forever." I slowly turned to her. She stood in the doorway, her face calm, but her eyes held concern. "I'm not hiding," I replied, knowing it was a lie. "Really?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because it seems to me that you're doing everything to avoid me." I didn't know what to say. Words stuck in my throat, and emotions that I had been trying to suppress began to surface. "This is wrong, Lillian," I finally said, my voice trembling. "We can't." "Can't what?" she interrupted, her tone sharper. "Can't feel what we feel? Why? Because someone said it's wrong." Her words hit me like thunder. I wanted to object, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. Instead, I just stood there, feeling my own beliefs crumble under her pressure. "You feel this just as I do," she continued, her voice softening. "You can lie to yourself, but I know the truth." I couldn't take it anymore. I turned away, hoping she would leave, but instead I heard her steps. She came closer, her presence filling the entire space. "Sam," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Look at me." I turned and our gazes met. In her eyes was such a mix of emotions that I couldn't decipher them. It was a blend of fear, desire, and something deeper that I couldn't understand. "This is wrong," I repeated, but my words sounded weak. "And what if it's right?" Her voice trembled, as if she was struggling with her own feelings. "And what if this is the only thing that matters?" Her words shattered the last remnants of my defenses. She reached out, her fingers gently touching my cheek. It was a light touch, but it caused a storm inside me. I knew I should stop her leave, but instead I stayed. She leaned closer, her breath touching my skin. This moment seemed endless, but I knew it would end. When her lips touched mine, it was like a whirlwind. It was not just a kiss. It was an explosion of all the emotions we had been suppressing.